A hut in the pines, solar panels, a closed door. Everything looks calm. Even the shift log is filled in hourly. But 100 feet away, there are tracks leading into a ravine and a cliff. And what would you do if everything was in place except the man himself? This is a story in which the order of the station turned out to be the beginning of disappearance. Tonto National Park, northern Arizona, spring 2007. Delta River Station is one of the most remote patrol posts in the park, located almost 30 miles from the nearest paved road. The place where the tourist trails end and the areas marked on the map only by drawings from the 60s begin. The hero of this story was Joel Frazer, 42 years old, a National Park Service employee, a veteran with nearly a decade of experience in this particular region. He was known as reliable and methodical. His colleagues said, "When Joel is on duty, everything is under control. He reports on the wind and monitors the solar panels as if his life depended on it." The Delta River Outpost is a wooden hut on a raised platform with antennas, satellite GPS, and a long-range radio. It's surrounded by 3 miles of pine forest, then rocky slopes, ravines, and only one exit, an old abandoned road through Cypress Gorge. It was rarely used. In the spring, after the rains, it turned into a stream of mud, and in the summer, it was covered with cracks and dust. Frazer took up his post on Friday, April 27th, at 8:30 a.m. According to the regulations, the shift lasted 4 days. Each day, he was required to report for service at 9 a.m. and 8 p.m. The first call went through as planned. The recording remains. Delta River, Frazer, weather stable, 0 disturbances, batteries working, temperature plus 61 Fahrenheit. The last transmission from Joel was recorded on Saturday, April 28th at 8:00 p.m. The wind picked up. I heard something near the southern slope. I'll go check in the morning. Everything is fine. End of communication. The next morning at 9, Joel had not returned the call. There was no immediate alarm. It happened. Interference. A bad antenna angle. Radio noise. But by Sunday evening, alarms were raised. Not only because Frazer had failed to make contact, but because the sensors at the station began reporting erratic readings. The batteries suddenly dropped to near 0, as if someone had unplugged the panels or shaded them. On Monday morning, a helicopter carrying an Air Force inspector and local ranger, Daniel Carter, arrived at Delta River. From the air, everything looked fine. The antenna was up, the door was closed, the chimney was intact. But inside the hut, there was no Joel, no backpack, no first aid kit, no map. On the bed lay a notebook, open to a page with a note. Heard footsteps in the night, twice, from the south. No one should be here. Thus began one of the strangest disappearances in Tonto Park. Joel Frazer vanished from a secure station without violence, without a call for help, and without apparent cause. But oddities began to appear almost immediately, and not all of them were specific to Frazer. When a person goes missing in Tonto Park, The first thing they do is look at the statistics. On average, 6 or 7 cases a year, almost all of them tourists who have lost their way. Their phones have died. Sometimes they get disoriented in the heat. In 11 years of service, Joel Frazer participated in 15 search and rescue operations. He knew how quickly a person loses orientation on the plateaus, how after 2 hours of wandering, he begins to walk in circles, how a tired tourist throws off things along the way, leaving breadcrumbs, only in the opposite order, from a backpack to a flask. He knew because he had mapped these cases. He had a cabinet full of files at his home in Flagstaff, neatly numbered cases, each with its route traced on tracing paper. He could explain almost all of the disappearances, except for 2. The first was Mark Hill, a 19-year-old Michigan student who disappeared 2 miles from the Delta River Outpost in 2001. Joel was on duty that year. They found Hill's boot in a ravine, but never his body. The second was a woman named Karen DeSoto, 36, who disappeared while hiking alone on the Gray Ridge Trail, 5 miles from the same outpost. Her phone's map had died at a point with no logical exit. Frazer had personally participated in both searches. He repeatedly pointed out in his reports, the section between the southern slope and the bed of the old stream is behaviorally anomalous. That's how he formulated it. According to him, people there lost the logic of movement. One tourist, found alive 3 days later, insisted that he was going north, although he had been moving southeast all the time. His GPS receiver, by the way, stopped recording the route after 4 hours. Frazer's colleagues considered him overly meticulous, but it was he who, after the DeSoto incident, insisted on installing an additional camera on the southern trail and regularly checked the time against the control mark. The last signal from this camera was received a day before his disappearance. And this was the first oddity. The camera's motion sensor picked up a silhouette at 23:08 on Friday, the night before Frazer first went off the air. The temperature was below 50 Fahrenheit. The humidity was high. The area was poorly lit. The frame showed a figure about 30 feet from the lens. The silhouette was unidentified, but the important thing was that if it was Joel, he left the station just 2 hours after arriving, at night, without reporting. If not, someone else was out there in the dark, near the base itself. The recording was saved, but from about midnight until dawn, the sensor no longer responded. The camera did not overload. The power did not turn off. It simply did not record movement. This is the recording that Ranger Daniel Carter brought aboard his helicopter when he flew back to headquarters. The file has been renamed 2308.pg and saved as a backup. When viewed in slow motion, the figure appears to stop and lean toward the ground before disappearing from the frame. A broken bush was later found near this spot. Underneath it is a sock, presumably from Frazer's uniform, but there were no tracks, no shoe prints, no characteristic depression from a fall, as if someone had been standing but not walking, or was too light to leave a mark. Daniel's report contains a phrase that was later deleted during editing. Frazer either knew who he was going out for or sensed something. He took everything with him except a flashlight. This week, when Frazer was supposed to leave his post, not a single signal came to the station. He did not report, did not transmit coordinates, and did not leave a log on the radio. An official request for a search operation was sent out on Wednesday. But when rescuers arrived at the southern route, it turned out that something had happened even earlier. It's early Tuesday morning, May 1st, 2007. An unusual radio signal is received at the National Park Service control room in Phoenix. The frequency is one of the backup encrypted channels used in emergencies, manually activated from one of the field transmitters. The problem was that the frequency had been decommissioned back in 2004. The transmitter that could theoretically have been on the air was at the old Rocky Gate Fire Lookout, about 8 miles from the Delta River Lookout, in an area officially considered dead to the signal. The call point was pinpointed to within half a mile. Analysis showed that the signal was transmitted once, lasting 4 seconds. The message contained no words, just the standard automatic code E21, which the system uses to mean operator in critical situation, immediate evacuation required. The signal was picked up at 5:47 a.m., just 10 minutes before sunrise. According to the base, not only was no one supposed to be in the area, but the transmitter itself had been shut down, disarmed, and taken off supply. Protocol called for ignoring single signals from inactive nodes. But the controller, Patricia Lynn, noted in her log, the transmitter is physically disabled. Someone activated it manually. At this point, Frazer was not officially considered missing, but internally, the service was already suspicious. When Carter reported Frazer's absence from his post and the oddities with the camera footage, it became clear that the disappearance did not seem like a standard case. 2 hours later, the first ground group set out for the Rocky Gate area. The weather was getting worse. Humidity had risen to 80%, and flood streams were making the journey difficult. As they approached the ruins of the observation post, the rescuers discovered an old dirt path along which someone had recently walked. There were partial boot prints on the dusty surface. Tracking led them to the site where the radio mast had once been. At the transmitter site, they found a plastic casing, opened and carefully closed again. Inside, there were traces of recent contact. Dust had been cleaned from the panel. There were fingerprints on the casing. The lab would later establish that the fingerprints belonged to Joel Frazer. Judging by the position of his palm, he was holding the side of the device as if he was getting up from his knees, but something even stranger was found nearby. Beneath the transmitter housing, in a wooden box secured to the remains of the foundation, lay a scrap of a topographic map. 2 areas had been circled with a marker, the southern slope and the so-called dead zone, about half a mile to the southwest. A place where there are no... At the bottom of the card is a handwritten inscription, probably made with a pencil. The handwriting is uncertain, like that of someone writing while hanging or in a hurry. If you find me, don't go beyond the line. This is not a path. There was no signature, but judging by the look of the paper, it had been torn from somewhere. The tier was uneven, with water and rust marks along the edge. At the time this map was discovered, the search had not yet officially begun. Only after Carter's report and the signal from Rock Gate was received was a Level 3 emergency declared, a helicopter group activated, and external search teams brought in. But they didn't know that on that very night, Monday into Tuesday, a tourist, a man named Bradley Montrose, who had accidentally camped out on the trail 12 miles to the south, had recorded something strange on his camera. He only noticed it a few days later when he was reviewing the video. The shot shows a faint light source flashing in the distance against the morning fog. A single dot moving slowly down the slope, stopping abruptly. Bradley thought it was another hiker, but the GPS log confirmed that there was no one else in the area. By Thursday morning, more than 30 people had arrived in the area between the Delta River Station and the ruins of the Rock Gate. Rescuers, investigators, and dog handlers. The search area was divided into sectors, but special attention was paid to two areas. The southern slope, where the camera recorded movement, and the hollow with the transmitter, from where the alarm signal was sent. 3 hours into the patrol, one of the dog handlers, a federal officer named Ray Lowry, recorded on his tape recorder, "The dog leads clearly. He enters the trail. Then he turns sharply to the left, where no trail map shows. The trail the dog pointed to ran along a ravine, but after 100 yards, it seemed to disappear. Instead, there was a patch of loose moss, dotted with old fire pits. At first glance, the place hadn't been used in decades. But one of the trackers noticed in the bushes lay a plastic bag of freeze-dried rations. The expiration date was 2008. Only Park Service employees used such rations. The trail the dog was following disappeared into the lowlands. There was a spot where the ground looked particularly sticky, as if saturated with water. The trackers noted that the soil was not of a seasonal nature. There had been no rain in the last few days, and the groundwater level in this area usually did not rise above 10 inches. However, there were no boot prints on the soft soil, not a single indented print, but there were others. Along the stream, tangentially, there were almost continuous tracks. Uneven, slightly blurred, but with a characteristic pattern of the sole. At first, they thought Frazer. But the markings showed. The step is unstable. The distance between the dots is different, as if the person was running, then stopping. And most importantly, the length of the step indicated a height of less than 5.5 feet. It could not be Joel. The trail ended in a narrow ravine, no more than 4 feet wide. The place was theoretically impassable. It was described as a bottleneck. On one side was a cliff, on the other a sheer wall. But from the broken bushes and torn bark, it was clear that someone had crawled through. 40 minutes later, the team found what was later entered into the main protocol under the code P47, personal item with identifying markings. It was a radio protective case. It had the initials JF embossed into the leather insert. The case was empty, but the important thing was that it wasn't hanging on the ground. It was found hanging from a tree branch about 7 feet up, as if someone had hung it on purpose or had walked past and gotten caught. Carter then gave the order to expand the search area beyond the route map. Internally, this decision caused tension. Such an area was considered uncontrolled for standard operations. But there were no alternatives, and then the first system failure occurred. At 9:30 in the morning, one of the search groups tried to get in touch. Without success. The radios began to lose signal within a 2-mile radius of the bottleneck. At first, they thought it was overload, but the problem worsened. GPS navigators began to show inaccurate coordinates, lagging behind by 10 to 20 minutes, as if they were writing the route with a delay. Orientation became impossible. The senior signalman issued a formulation that was later included in the final report. Local anomaly in transmission and reception. Signal is refracted or distorted. Electromagnetic interference is possible. At this stage, it was decided to suspend further advance beyond the ridge until Friday morning. A helicopter group was to assess the terrain and conduct aerial photography. But that same night, one of the rescuers, a former soldier named Thomas Mitchell, returned to camp in a state of great agitation. He claimed to have heard a voice on his radio, a man's, distorted, as if through a broken transmitter. "Daniel, answer! Don't go south." The voice repeated itself twice. The first time at 11:20, the second time 3 minutes later. After that, the air went silent. The problem was that Daniel Carter was not in the communications sector that night. His radio was turned off. No one could contact him directly, much less tell him exactly where he was going the next day. Friday morning began with a flyby survey of the southern slope and the gorge where the Bottle Trail led. The helicopter with the operator of the National Geodetic Service took off at 6:40. The flyby lasted no more than 20 minutes. Already on the first circle, something was noticed that had not been recorded on any of the previous maps. On the slope, 100 feet below the ridge, lay an object, casting a shadow in the direction of the western slope. The coordinates were transmitted to the rescue team. The group moved to the point of discovery. There, among the brush and scattered rocks, lay an overturned backpack. The model corresponded to the standard equipment of Rangers, ALPS Commander, Army green with unloading belts. On the inside of the valve, a tag, Frazer Joel, issued 2005 Drashirsh Unit, Delta River. The backpack was open, the contents partially scattered, a map, 2 packed dry rations, a first aid kit without bandages, 1 plastic flask with half evaporated water. But most importantly, there was a notebook in the side compartment. Not official, but personal. The pages are duplicated with thin tracing paper written by hand. The last notes are made in pencil. The nature of the handwriting shows that it was written in the air, unevenly. Some lines are repeated. I listen at night. Someone is walking, not an animal. It's hard. If anyone finds it, let them not follow the river. It is not the way. I see the light, but it is not above the forest line. No one should be here. I heard my name on frequency 209. The last entry is dated 29/44/07, 04.51, almost 2 days before the signal from Rocky Gate. There were no more entries. The maps found in the backpack were of particular interest. On the main topographic map of the area south of the Delta River Outpost was circled in bold marker. Several lines were drawn by hand where there was no official trail. They resembled a route map, as if someone was trying to record the route, with turns and crossings of riverbeds. Each point was marked with time, as in observation logs. The last one, Warus 23, sound, stop, second signal, does not respond to light. The words unresponsive to light will be discussed later in the reports. It is unclear what exactly Frazer meant. Was it related to an animal, a person, an object? But one thing is known. At that moment, he was still alive and observing. Important point. The hand-drawn route matched the GPS track recorded on the faulty navigator found in the same backpack. The device turned on, but did not show the current location. However, the track with the route of the last 2 days was red. And there was another discrepancy. According to the coordinates, Joel crossed Glen Creek Gorge at 2 a.m., but according to satellite data, there was a rescue team there at that moment. They didn't record any sound, movement, or tracks. It was as if Joel was walking parallel but out of perception. Physically, it is impossible, but the track was clear. The points corresponded to turns, riverbeds, sections with characteristic. That evening, one of the volunteers who had been surveying the southern part of the ridge reported that he had noticed a reflection on the southern side of the slope. It seemed to him that someone had pointed a mirror or other light source at him, very briefly, once, like a glare, but no one was heading that way, and no one should have been there. On Saturday, May 5th, an additional communications channel was added to the search operation. It used a backup frequency of the Search and Emergency Support Service, which is usually activated in the event of a major disaster. It had less interference and did not interfere with radio signals from tourists or security. At 5:42 p.m., the Southern Point's communications officer, Utah volunteer Dan Rowell, raised the alarm. He had picked up an unauthorized call. "Delta, this is Delta. Over. Answer, I'm downstairs." The voice was distorted, but clearly male, with a distinctive Western accent. Judging by the strength of the signal, the source was within a mile or two. Dan answered, but there was a pause in the air. 7 seconds later, the voice came again. "I'm down there. I can see the river. Can you hear me?" Rowell acknowledged and asked for an ID, but there was no response. The connection was lost. The total transmission time was 3 minutes and 9 seconds. That was enough for the radio operators to determine the direction. southwest, the area between the old Cortez River and the Black Ridge Fault, a place where trails had long been blocked by landslides and where neither foot nor air routes went. 2 people were immediately sent there with a portable scanner and a GPS beacon, but contact with them was lost 10 minutes after they started moving. The radio was silent. According to protocol, they were supposed to return. 40 minutes later, they came back, lost and disoriented. One of them, Thomas Sykes, later said, "I had the feeling that we were going up, but the slope of the ground said otherwise. When I turned on the GPS, it showed that I was standing still, but I was walking. I was really walking." The signal from the unknown was not repeated, but when the engineers deciphered the background noise from the original recording, they found a second layer of signal in the spectrum below the audible range. Not a voice, but something resembling a duplicate transmission. After filtering, the phrase sounded like, "Don't shine, I see, he's gone." Against this background, a new factor appeared. Radio transmission logs from May 2003 were lifted from the service's archive. A similar signal of similar length from the same sector was received exactly 4 years earlier. At that time, it was considered interference. The location is the same. The service began to consider 2 versions. The first is that Frazer is alive, disoriented, but trying to make contact using the old frequency. The second is that someone is imitating his voice, using access to his radio, possibly found or captured. But soon, a third trace appeared. On Saturday evening, while the group was exploring the Black Ridge area, they came across a rock with a mark on it, an arrow scratched into the stone, pointing downwards. Underneath it were the letters DFR, an abbreviation Frazer used in his personal notes, Delta Frazer Radio. Underneath the rock was a small ditch covered with foliage. Inside were neatly laid stones and a folding knife, a service knife, engraved, Frazer J, 2002. The knife was clean, as if it had been recently wiped. No dirt, no traces of blood. But on the bottom end was a scrap of fabric, a white strip with a tear, like from a shirt. An examination would show the fiber composition was identical to a Park Service uniform shirt. Was this an attempt to leave a trace, or something hidden by someone else? Later that night, back at the camp, someone turned on one of the portable radios, and at exactly 11:11 p.m., the airwaves came alive. One voice, one call, clear and unambiguous. "The river is not here. They are looking from above." 10 days after Joel Frazer disappeared, the search was officially over. The report listed over 160 people, 7 helicopter sorties, 89 hours of ground crew work. No body, no final signal, no evidence of Frazer's whereabouts were found. But the decision to close Delta River Station was not made on the basis of the report, and not publicly. An internal memo to the National Park Service, signed by the Deputy Director of Field Operations, was labeled "Temporary Closure of the Site due to risks to personnel." The order went into effect in June 2007. Officially, for technical and climatic reasons. The wording did not stand up to scrutiny. The building was in good working order. Power had been restored. The antennas were working. But informal evidence soon began to appear. The first was an anonymous post that appeared in August on a closed forum for Park Service employees. The user, OldWatcher07, claimed to have participated in a tour of the station a week before it closed. He described feeling like another person was within 50 feet of the building during the day, despite no visible signs. He also reported feeling like hearing was suppressed and temperature swings inside the hut from 68 to 43 degrees Fahrenheit in half an hour, with no wind at all. The second is the testimony of the technicians who dismantled the equipment. One of them, Brian Riddell, 2 years later, off the record, told a journalist that when they dismantled the radio station panel, they found a strange distortion in the wiring harness, as if something had melted the winding from the inside. The log noted damage from a short circuit, but the melting point of the insulation exceeds 1,000 degrees. This is impossible under normal operating conditions. Third, there are deviations in the movement logs. In the last 3 months before Frazer disappeared, sensors on the trails near the station recorded movement at night 4 times. On each of these occasions, the post was empty. No one was on duty. But the cameras installed for monitoring recorded nothing. The tapes showed only interference and brief jumps in exposure. Against this backdrop, Frazer's family has been trying to get the case reopened. His younger sister, Carolyn, has written to the Department of the Interior, demanding to know why the area is closed to inspection. There has been no response. In a phone call with Arizona Watch, she said, "I don't need theories. I just know he didn't leave. Joel couldn't have left his post at night without a flashlight. He wouldn't have done that. He knew someone or heard someone. I don't know." In 2009, the Delta River site was removed from public maps. On modern GPS and trackers, this point is marked as technical sector access restricted. Today, the station building still stands. Access is prohibited. Departmental patrols do not service it. According to unofficial data, twice in 2010 and 2014, lone tourists were spotted in the vicinity, claiming to have seen light from the mountain path, despite the lack of windows and electricity at the site. There were no more signals coming from that area, but the archive still contains one final transmission, recorded from an automatic station 60 miles to the south, 7 months after Frazer disappeared. It contains a short phrase conveyed in a distorted voice. "Don't turn it off. They can only hear in the dark.